Hey guys, tonight we're going to slowly drift into a world where delicious meals might be your worst nightmare. Yes, we're talking about being a royal food taster in medieval and early modern Europe, a job that, on paper, might sound like a dream, sampling gourmet dishes, eating rich desserts, tasting exotic spices, but in reality, well, let's just say it had a few complications. So, dim the lights, settle in, and let's gently explore why it really sucked to be a royal food taster. First, let's set the scene. Imagine the castle kitchen. Huge fireplaces, boiling cauldrons, clanging pots, and a dizzying array of meats, sauces, and desserts. The food smells amazing. The chefs are bustling, and you, the royal taster, are standing nervously at a long wooden table, because every bite you take could be your last. Literally, kings and queens had enemies, assassins, and political rivals, and a well-poisoned meal could change the course of history in seconds. Your job was to eat, analyze, and swallow, or sometimes spit out, the food before it reached the monarch's lips. And failure, well, failure often meant death. Let's float over to England, shall we? The Tudors were notorious for their obsession with security. A taster might chew through a royal pie, carefully monitoring for bitterness, odd flavors, or anything suspicious. And sometimes, the king's paranoia was extreme. Henry VIII, for example, reportedly kept tasters on edge because he trusted very few people. One wrong move, one hesitation, or even a nervous glance could draw the wrong kind of attention. So, yes, being a taster could be deadly serious work, even if it looked like you were just enjoying a snack. Now, consider the constant pressure. Royal tasters weren't just sampling food. They were evaluating quality, ensuring safety, and maintaining the king's or queen's culinary pleasure. Imagine having to eat every dish like your life depends on it, balancing taste, presentation, and your own fear of sudden demise. Add to that the expectation to appear cheerful, competent, and trustworthy, and you get a perfect recipe for anxiety. The irony? People would see you smiling at a lavish banquet and assume you were living the dream. Meanwhile, inside, you were calculating the likelihood of survival for every bite. In France, during the reign of Louis XIV, the Sun King, tasters faced a different kind of challenge. French cuisine was elaborate, extravagant, and often exotic. Sauces, imported spices, and complex pastries filled royal tables. Tasters had to identify subtle differences in flavors, but also detect the slightest hint of poison. And yes, that included arsenic, mercury, or mysterious herbal concoctions. Their lives depended on a combination of taste, intuition, and luck. Some records suggest tasters had to chew, then discreetly spit, rinse their mouths, and still remain polite and composed, because etiquette never sleeps, even if your own life is on the line. Now let's drift into the social awkwardness of the job. Being a taster meant you were constantly under scrutiny. Nobles might gossip about your competence, chefs might resent your opinions, and the monarch might test your loyalty at any moment. You weren't just eating food, you were navigating a web of suspicion, expectation, and fragile social hierarchies. One small mistake could ruin your career, or worse, and, as with many royal professions, favoritism and political intrigue often determined whether a taster thrived or ended up absent from the next banquet entirely. The dangers weren't only from poison. Some tasters suffered from overwork, indigestion, and long-term health issues because of the sheer quantity and richness of food consumed daily. Imagine sampling heavily salted meats, spicy sauces, and sugary desserts over and over, without a break. And often, tasters weren't allowed to eat the food for pleasure. It was always work, always serious, always under pressure. The irony is delicious. A job that looked like luxury was physically and mentally exhausting. Let's float over to a slightly darker side of history. In some cultures, royal tasters were also responsible for tasting wine, ale, or other beverages. This added layers of complexity. Alcohol could hide poisons, but excessive drinking could kill the taster slowly rather than quickly. The taster had to find a delicate balance, enough to detect danger, but not so much that they became incapacitated or ill. And of course, they had to maintain their dignity, because spilling wine or spilling suspicion could be disastrous. Beyond danger and pressure, there's the mundane, often overlooked discomfort of the job. Tasters were often required to be present at all royal meals, sometimes standing for hours. Kitchens were hot, smoky, and chaotic. Flies, rodents, and the occasional cockroach were common. Food could be spoiled without notice, and tasters couldn't simply refuse or complain. Their lives were a constant negotiation between taste, survival, and social performance. Even today, we might think, oh, what a cushy job. But in reality, it was exhausting, anxiety-inducing, and occasionally lethal. Now, imagine the emotional strain. Royal tasters were not allowed to express genuine displeasure. If a dish tasted bad or dangerous, they had to remain composed. Humor, sarcasm, or exasperation was dangerous. Expressing fear could be misread as incompetence or disloyalty. In a world where a bite could end your life, emotional control was essential. Every meal was a test of both taste and nerves. And of course, there's the occasional absurdity. Some kings tested tasters deliberately, giving them bizarre or repulsive combinations of ingredients as a prank or a loyalty test. One wrong reaction could be deadly serious or subtly humiliating. Imagine chewing through a plate of mystery meat, trying to maintain composure while knowing the king is watching, perhaps even laughing quietly at your predicament. The mix of danger, expectation, and ridiculousness made the role uniquely stressful. So, by now, you might be thinking, why would anyone want this job? Well, some tasters enjoyed social standing, access to the court, and influence. If you survived long enough, you could develop favor with the monarch, earning gifts, privileges, and occasionally land. But these rewards came with immense risk and daily tension. Life as a taster was precarious, balancing luxury and danger in equal measure. Let's drift briefly into global perspective. In China, royal tasters were similarly important. The emperor's food had to be free of poison, and tasters often faced strict rules and surveillance. Their lives were tightly controlled, their movements monitored, and mistakes were not forgiven lightly. The same pattern appears across cultures. The taster's life was fascinating to outsiders, but fraught with peril, pressure, and subtle absurdity for those living it. Finally, as we gently close part 1, let's reflect on the emotional and human side of being a royal food taster. It wasn't just about poison or duty. It was about anxiety, vigilance, awkward social performance, and the strange blend of luxury and terror. One bite could make history. One misstep could end your story entirely. And yet, tasters endured, found ways to navigate their dangerous roles, and occasionally even thrived, quietly asserting human resilience in the most unusual of workplaces. All right, let's drift further into the strange, often dangerous world of royal food tasters. By now, we can see that this job was a peculiar blend of privilege, anxiety, and daily peril. But what was it really like for the people who lived it? Let's explore some historical examples, because as always, the past is stranger than fiction. First, consider the case of Thomas Dangerfield, or at least someone like him in England. While not officially a taster in every record, royal staff often had similar duties, tasting food and wine before the monarch's first bite. Imagine standing in the grand hall, polished floors reflecting candlelight, surrounded by nervous courtiers and bustling servants. A sumptuous dish appears. Roasted pheasant with exotic spices. You take a careful bite. Flavor notes, texture, temperature, all must be assessed. But wait, is that a hint of bitter almonds? Could it be cyanide? Is it just your imagination? Every swallow could be fatal, and yet you smile, nod, and declare, "Exquisite, Your Majesty," because hesitation might signal suspicion or incompetence. Now, let's float gently to France. Louis XIV, the Sun King, maintained a sprawling court at Versailles, complete with elaborate meals designed to display wealth, power, and taste. Royal tasters there faced extraordinary pressure. Not only did they have to survive potential poisoning, but they also had to keep up with the king's insatiable appetite for novelty. Exotic spices, imported fruits, and lavish sauces constantly challenged the taster's palate. And yes, the Sun King reportedly enjoyed subtle tests of loyalty, deliberately adding strange or bitter ingredients to observe the taster's reaction. One wrong facial expression could be interpreted as disloyalty, incompetence, or even mockery. Let's pause for a moment to consider the social dynamics. Tasters were often highly educated in culinary knowledge, yet simultaneously powerless in the hierarchy. Chefs could resent them for critiquing their dishes, courtiers might gossip about them, and monarchs could treat them as expendable. It was a precarious position, filled with tension, subtle competition, and constant observation. And for the common person looking in, the taster's life probably seemed like a dream, but appearances were deceiving. Luxury, in this context, came wrapped in anxiety, vigilance, and ever-present danger. Across Europe, royal tasters frequently experienced near-death incidents. In Poland, for instance, tasters reportedly faced danger not only from poisoned food, but from political rivals who wanted to harm the monarch indirectly. A taster's palate, judgment, and composure became critical instruments in the survival of kings and queens. Imagine chewing a rich stew, knowing that a single mistake could alter the course of your life in seconds. Anxiety was not incidental, it was constant, a quiet companion at every meal. Moving eastward, Chinese imperial courts offer another perspective. Emperors there maintained highly regimented systems for tasters, whose lives were constantly monitored. It was said that tasters often had limited personal freedom, and that even slight errors could result in punishment or execution. The Chinese example reinforces a recurring theme: royal food tasting. Across cultures and centuries, combined danger, social expectation, and absurdly high stakes. It was never just about flavor. It was about survival, perception, and loyalty. Now, let's drift to the practical, human side of the job. Tasters weren't just evaluating taste. They were constantly chewing, spitting, rinsing, and swallowing under pressure. Meals could be repetitive or unusually rich, leading to indigestion or long-term health problems. Food poisoning, ironically, was not always intentional. Hygiene standards were inconsistent, kitchens were crowded, and storage was unreliable. The taster had to navigate both deliberate danger and mundane hazards, often without complaint, because showing distress was dangerous in itself. Consider the psychological strain. Imagine sampling every dish with life or death stakes while maintaining a cheerful, composed demeanor. The pressure could be exhausting, isolating, and subtly humiliating. Yet tasters persisted, demonstrating an unusual combination of courage, discipline, and social intelligence. Humor, irony, and subtle wit may have offered relief, but the tension was never far away. A single mistake could ruin your life, or end it. Then there's the occasional absurdity that adds dark humor to the historical record. Some monarchs, out of paranoia or mischief, deliberately tested tasters with disgusting or repulsive ingredients. Spoiled meat, bitter herbs, or bizarre combinations could appear on the royal table. The taster's response mattered. A subtle grimace might be tolerated. A visible reaction could be fatal or politically disastrous. Imagine having to swallow a particularly unappetizing concoction while maintaining the appearance of delight. Comedy and tragedy were closely intertwined in the life of a taster. And yet, despite the danger, tasters sometimes wielded influence. By virtue of proximity to the monarch and expertise in culinary matters, they could shape menus, advise on food, policy, or subtly influence court politics. Surviving long enough to gain favor offered status, gifts, and occasionally wealth. But this reward was precarious, balanced against constant danger, scrutiny, and the absurdities of court life. One day, you were praised for your palate. The next day, your life could hinge on a single suspicious stew. Let's drift toward more personal stories. Some tasters reportedly developed close relationships with monarchs, earning trust and even friendship. Others suffered tragedy, either by poison, accident, or political intrigue. Records from England, France, and China suggest a pattern. Proximity to power offered privilege, but also relentless vulnerability. The taster's life was a strange paradox: luxury and fear, influence and exposure, taste and survival, all intertwined. Finally, let's touch on the emotional toll. The constant vigilance, social expectation, and high stakes created stress, anxiety, and subtle isolation. Tasters had to be disciplined, composed, and observant at all times. Humor, if expressed, had to be carefully calibrated. Fear, if shown, could be deadly. And yet, humans persisted. They found ways to navigate these pressures, occasionally using charm, intelligence, or wit to survive, and sometimes even thrive. All right, let's float deeper into the perilous and absurd world of royal food tasting. By now, it should be clear that this job was a strange mix of privilege, danger, and social theater. But there's even more to the story. The reality of being a taster wasn't just high-stakes work. It was also filled with bizarre moments, near-death experiences, and ironic twists that could make anyone quietly reconsider the glamour of court life. Let's start with some near-death stories that have survived in historical records. In Poland, during the reign of Sigismund III, royal tasters reportedly faced both accidental and deliberate poisoning attempts. Some nobles, attempting to remove rivals or curry favor with the king, would secretly slip toxins into dishes. The taster had to detect these subtle changes in flavor or odor, often with very little time or margin for error. One bite too late, or one hesitation, and the taster might end up as an unfortunate example of royal vigilance. In England, the story of the Tudor court illustrates the tension perfectly. Henry VIII, while famously obsessed with culinary delights, also harbored deep paranoias about poison. Tasters were in constant danger, even from the very foods they were meant to enjoy. Imagine tasting a stew prepared by a nervous chef who feared the king's wrath, while simultaneously wondering if your own death was being plotted. That kind of anxiety, repeated at every meal, made life extremely tense and occasionally absurdly ironic. After all, the very dishes meant to demonstrate wealth, sophistication, and culture were also tools of fear and control. Now, let's drift gently to France. Louis XIV's banquets at Versailles were legendary. Long tables, dozens of courses, delicate pastries, and exotic spices from around the world. For the royal taster, however, these banquets were less about indulgence and more about survival. Some records suggest that tasters had to chew, swirl, and swallow, then discreetly spit out portions to avoid overindulgence, while still ensuring no poison was present. And yes, the king occasionally tested tasters with subtly poisoned food just to observe their reaction, a combination of danger, absurdity, and quiet psychological pressure. The taster's role was equal parts gourmet expertise and high-stakes detective work. Beyond poison, there were the bizarre culinary experiments that monarchs occasionally enjoyed. Imagine a dish with ingredients you've never heard of, combined in ways that seemed deliberately challenging. Exotic meats, unusual herbs, or strange textures tested not only the taster's palate, but their nerves and self-control. Chew too quickly, hesitate, or grimace, and you risked royal displeasure or subtle political fallout. In some cases, monarchs appeared to enjoy watching tasters squirm, perhaps as a reminder of the precariousness of life in proximity to absolute power. The social aspect added yet another layer of tension. Tasters were constantly observed by courtiers, chefs, and servants. Gossip about competence, loyalty, or reaction to royal pranks could spread quickly. A taster who reacted poorly might earn disdain, or worse, suspicion. Conversely, a skilled taster could earn influence, favor, or material rewards, but always at the cost of relentless vigilance. The delicate balance of authority, survival, and etiquette shaped every bite, every swallow, and every subtle facial expression. Let's float toward another European example, the Spanish court. Here, tasters were sometimes employed not only to detect poison, but also to ensure consistency in flavors, especially for dishes sent across the kingdom or for visiting dignitaries. The taster's judgment could impact diplomacy, royal image, and even economic decisions. In other words, chewing carefully was not merely a matter of personal survival. It was a small act of political responsibility. Every spoonful carried weight beyond taste, blending culinary skill, life or death stakes, and courtly duty. And yes, there's the practical discomfort to consider. Kitchens were hot, smoky, and chaotic. The taster stood for hours, consumed rich and heavy foods, and had little chance for rest. Flies, rodents, and occasional spoiled ingredients added to the challenge. Hygiene, both in terms of the kitchen and personal, was inconsistent. The irony is thick. A job that appeared luxurious to outsiders, standing near lavish tables, sampling exotic dishes, was physically exhausting, mentally draining, and fraught with danger. Now, a quick drift to the emotional strain. Tasters had to remain composed, cheerful, and attentive at all times. Expressing displeasure, fear, or disgust could be disastrous. Even subtle expressions, a raised eyebrow, a pause in chewing, slight grimace, could be interpreted as disrespect or incompetence. The pressure required extraordinary self-control. Humor, irony, and wit might occasionally relieve stress, but the fundamental tension remained constant. Every meal was a test of taste, judgment, and nerves. Let's not forget the absurdity baked into the job. Some monarchs, particularly those with mischievous or paranoid tendencies, deliberately created ridiculous tasting scenarios. Spoiled meat, bitter herbs, or strange ingredient combinations were occasionally served as tests of loyalty, composure, or courage. Imagine swallowing a particularly unappetizing concoction while trying to maintain dignity, knowing the king is watching and perhaps quietly judging every nuance of your reaction. Survival required not just taste, but poker-faced mastery of human expression. In addition to personal danger, there was the constant threat of political intrigue. Tasters could become pawns, intentionally or unintentionally, in plots to destabilize the court. Chefs, courtiers, and rivals could use food as a subtle weapon. Detecting poison wasn't merely a culinary skill, it was a political necessity. The taster's life was a tightrope walk between flavor, safety, social expectation, and courtly observation. One misstep, even an innocent one, could prove disastrous. Despite all this, some tasters enjoyed rare privileges: proximity to the monarch, influence over menus, and occasional gifts or recognition provided incentives. Some even became trusted advisors or courtiers. Yet, every reward came with the persistent undercurrent of danger. One day, you were praised for your discerning palate. The next day, a suspicious dish could decide your fate. The juxtaposition of luxury and peril defined the life of a royal taster. All right, now let's drift even deeper into the peculiar, sometimes absurd life of a royal food taster. By this point, you should have a pretty good sense that it wasn't just tasting food. It was a delicate dance of survival, etiquette, and social maneuvering. But the stories get stranger, more ironic, and occasionally outright bizarre. Let's start with courtly pranks. Monarchs, as we've hinted, occasionally found amusement in testing tasters. Some of these pranks were subtle: a tiny twist of an herb, a slightly off-balance spice blend, or a strange, unexpected ingredient. The taster had to react appropriately, or at least appear to. A wince, a pause, or even a skeptical look could lead to tension or disfavor. In essence, tasters weren't just employees. They were part of a bizarre, psychological game played at the highest levels of society. One particularly odd tradition in Europe involved trial dishes, designed specifically to observe tasters' reactions. Chefs would prepare foods that were technically safe but unpleasant in taste or texture. Perhaps it was overcooked meat, under-seasoned soup, or an unusual combination of flavors meant to test composure. The monarch would then watch, noting every blink, gesture, or hesitation. Imagine chewing a questionable stew, holding back nausea, and praying that your poker face was convincing enough. The absurdity of it all underscores the precariousness of the role. A combination of culinary expertise, emotional discipline, and sheer luck. In some courts, tasters were also involved in ceremonial or symbolic roles. For instance, in France and England, tasters occasionally participated in public banquets as visible figures of trustworthiness. Their presence reassured guests that the food was safe, while also emphasizing the monarch's power and paranoia. But being on display meant even more scrutiny, both from the monarch and from peers. Every gesture, every bite, every subtle facial expression was observed, recorded in memory or rumor, and could influence reputation or survival. Now let's drift toward the strange diets tasters endured. While monarchs enjoyed exotic foods, tasters often had to eat the same dishes repeatedly, sometimes at odd hours, to ensure safety. Over time, this could lead to digestive issues, fatigue, and subtle long-term health consequences. Imagine sampling heavily salted meats, rich sauces, and sugar-laden desserts dozens of times in a week. Add heat, smoke, and stress from crowded kitchens, and the life of a taster begins to look less like luxury and more like endurance sport. Interestingly, tasters sometimes had to be involved in alcohol evaluation. Wine, ale, or other beverages could be poisoned or adulterated. Tasters were expected to detect subtle differences while maintaining composure and judgment. Drinking too much could impair their skills, or worse, cause illness. Drinking too little risked missing a threat. The careful balance of consumption, observation, and subtle judgment became a daily performance, one that few could truly master without constant vigilance. Let's pause to consider the emotional toll. Royal tasters were under almost constant anxiety. Each meal could be fatal, each gesture scrutinized, and each bite carried hidden risks. Stress, social isolation, and subtle humiliation became constant companions. Humor, irony, and wit may have offered relief, but the fundamental tension never vanished. Tasting food in a royal court was both work and survival, a strange combination of gourmet assessment, espionage, and endurance. Some of the most bizarre records involve tasters' reactions to particularly unusual or challenging foods. Imagine tasting a dish of fermented fish or meat cooked in unfamiliar ways, or exotic fruits that challenge the palate and the stomach. The monarch might watch, curious whether the taster could maintain composure. A taster's ability to endure the bizarre, unpleasant, or unfamiliar could determine both reputation and survival. Life was a constant negotiation between taste, judgment, and composure. Let's drift briefly toward this social paradox. Tasters were technically servants, yet they often gained intimate proximity to the monarch. Their advice, discretion, and judgment could earn rare privileges, trust, or even influence. Yet, despite these occasional advantages, tasters remained vulnerable, expendable, and perpetually under observation. Socially, they occupied a liminal space, close to power, yet never secure. This ironic position, luxury and danger entwined, is a recurring theme in the history of the profession. Across Europe, similar patterns emerge. In the Spanish court, tasters faced pressure from both poison and protocol. In England, monarchs like Henry VIII and Elizabeth maintained intense oversight of their kitchens. In France, Louis XIV's elaborate banquets created subtle, continuous stress for tasters, and in China, strict imperial rules created formalized systems that constrained personal freedom, while simultaneously placing tasters in positions of immense trust and danger. Despite cultural differences, the underlying challenges, danger, social scrutiny, emotional discipline, remained remarkably consistent. One particularly ironic aspect was the combination of danger and reward. Successful tasters could gain status, gifts, or influence. Some became trusted figures in court politics, advisors in culinary matters, or even close companions to the monarch. Yet these rewards were never guaranteed. A single misstep, a misjudged expression, or a subtle error could end a career or a life. Luxury existed side by side with lethal risk. Each day was a test of composure, taste, and subtle psychological skill. Even the simplest tasks were complicated. Evaluating the temperature, texture, and aroma of a dish required careful focus. Watching the monarch's reaction required simultaneous observation and judgment. Predicting subtle threats, poison, political intrigue, or accidents required vigilance and intuition, and somehow, tasters were expected to appear cheerful, competent, and loyal throughout. It's almost impossible to imagine such a combination of skill, endurance, and subtle social awareness being demanded today. All right, let's drift further into the peculiar and perilous existence of royal food tasters. By now, you should have a pretty clear picture. It wasn't just about flavor or food. It was a strange mix of survival, etiquette, social navigation, and subtle absurdity. But there's more to explore. The long-term consequences of the role, bizarre historical anecdotes, and the quiet ironies that defined life at the royal table.